Welcome back to the Whole Person Revolution. It's been a little while since the first episode of a season in which Comment was exploring the theme of violence, a stretch of apparent silence and delay that I want to apologize for and explain. A month after my team and I dropped the episode with June Park called The Grief Catcher, a poignant, really quite beautiful conversation about trauma, accompaniment, hospice, and chaplaincy, we dropped a new episode featuring two guests, one a Jewish Israeli and one a Palestinian Christian, whose collaboration in the long work of peacemaking I intended to be encouraging to and instructive for you, our listeners, in the context of the horrors we have all been watching and many of us personally affected by in the Middle East on and since October 7th. For me, recording it as I did while dealing with some not so pleasant ambushes from the left and bullying from the right in navigating the present North American minefield activated in a unique way by the events in the Middle East, the conversation with these two men, both of whom are presently living in Israel, arrived to me as a gift of gentleness, of the power of friendship to fuel important work across long-standing divides, and a kind of keep the faith realism around how one manages the work of hope when conflict in the present seems so intense, deep, ancient, and intractable. Now, there were some statements made by my two guests about the U.S., quote, bankrolling a genocide in Gaza, about the just cause of U.S. campus protesters, statements which, by the time the actual conversation aired 8 days after its initial recording, met a cresting wave in public opinion, crashing down against a protest movement that many saw as becoming increasingly unruly, unreasonable, and seeding violence in its own right. Hours after the episode aired, an older Canadian listener wrote, incensed, accusing me and this podcast of being irresponsible and worse, a quote, unabashed supporter of Hamas. Carta's leadership, concerned by this kind of an email, listened to the episode, and while they could not and did not condone this listener's accusation, did wince at some of the stronger political statements made by my guests without any real public pushback from me. And out of an abundance of caution at a particularly fried moment in our public discourse some weeks ago, asked me to take down the episode as a standalone cultural artifact that risked more misinterpretation of Curtis's own frames and public theology than it was worth. There is much I've learned from this one-time episode publication and retraction, and frankly, much I'm still wrestling with and seeking to reconcile for future wisdom. For those of you in leadership positions stewarding today's arena of faith-seeking understanding, I imagine you recognize all too well the ways in which the call to be hospitable to different perspectives, the call to honor one's host organization and protect its mission, the call to respect the realpolitik of stakeholders' interests, and the call of bridge building between very different worlds are calls that do not easily play together, perhaps especially right now. We need to have cultivated a careful mix of courage and realism to accept an imperfect set of choices in this broken world and to choose. Today, I want to talk about just these challenges facing leaders and institutions right now, seeking to be wise and just in an era of war and division. I've opted to serve up two conversations to you. One that happened after the offending incident with two of my own colleagues at Cardis, Ray Pennings and Brian Dykema. And the second conversation dropped separately as its own standalone episode with two employees of Telos, the organization that seeks to form American leaders of many stripes into peacemakers and justice bearers. These are two different organizations, Cardis and Telos, with different histories, different theories of change, different cognitions, you might say, and very different expertise. Cardis, I work for and have worked for the last 5 years with loads of gratitude and quiet pride. Telos, I am a student of and a friend to with great gratitude and appreciation. I hope something in the complexity each conversation attempts to articulate strangely gives you comfort, that you are not alone, that we need one another, often different others, to figure out how best to walk through the thorniest thickets, and that even if not every bloody conflict will be resolved and healed this side of Christ's return, that it is worth it to study and debate the pathways to a just peace with every lever we have available to us. So now, welcome to the first conversation with my own colleagues, Brian and Ray, Brian Dykema and Ray Pennings. Here we go. Welcome, gents, to the Whole Person Revolution.
Thank you, Anne.
It's our privilege.
So at the risk of stating something that's way overstated and super obvious, at least to those of us who talk about social architecture and study society, I'm just going to say the obvious thing. It's no secret that institutions of all stripes have been struggling in recent years. They've struggled with a whole bunch of things. I'll just name a few highlights: eroding trust, the speed of change culturally and technologically. They've struggled with shifting norms around privacy and the boundaries between public and private, of the distinction between morality and politics, and just how to keep one's own institutional telos clear and unchanging in the midst of just so many pressured crosswinds. Ray, not to call you out, but of the three of us, you are the most seasoned, at least by a little bit. And you did co-found the organization we all work for, Cardis. You've led an institution for quite a while now, even as you've, I think, also observed all manner of institutions in precisely this era of turbulence. I'm just curious how, at a very broad level to start here, how you would name some of the repeated core challenges facing institutions seeking to serve the common good these last 20 years. You know, what are the patterns and some of the difficulties facing very well-intentioned leaders that maybe were a little less true, say, in the latter decades of the 20th century?
I'm not sure I'd want to situate the conversation as if it's that much different than it was 50 or 100 years ago. I think there are two constant challenges that you face in the public square. One is that there are issues of conflict that are surface, and there are other that are relatively easy to manage, and there are fundamental issues, of which the one we're going to talk about this morning is very deeply held. And no matter how skilled you are, there are some deeper things that are underneath that you're just not going to manage your way to a solution. They're beyond politics. They're beyond any one institution. They involve core issues of identity, core issues of belief that are not solvable. So the question is not necessarily how do you find the ideal solution, but how do you find a way to live together in the midst of the difference and the conflict? I think the second point I would make, and this involves almost every issue, I don't think if you're going to be a responsible leader, you can avoid taking a side. There needs to be moral clarity. Now, I'm very conscious of trying to understand the other side before I defend my own. I want to deal with the best arguments and understand the best things of the other side, not create straw men and win an argument. It's actually about demonstrating understanding. But at the end of the day, it can't be just your response can't be on the one hand this, on the other hand that. It actually needs to be a position with some moral clarity. But that clarity needs to understand the complexity. And then thirdly, and I think most fundamentally, it's delivered with a humility and an empathy. These issues are ones that we're not going to solve. And if you come in and say, I've got the answer, you're almost certain that you don't. And secondly, you're not going to be listened to unless you can demonstrate an empathy for all sides, because fundamentally we're dealing with fellow human beings on all sides who are fellow image bearers of God.
Thanks, Ray. You partly were having this conversation as a result of all that occurred on October 7th and the retribution that has followed since. So Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's response to that in Gaza, and then the ripple effects of that ricocheting around the world, but with particular valence in the North American context. And this is not a new thing, but with this conflict, but I think as it has worked itself out over the last 7 to 8 months, it has placed sort of brought to a head, I think, the kinds of pressures on institutions and their leaders that you were sort of just describing. Some of these pressures I've experienced firsthand, as illustrated at the outset, and which I think the two of you have also experienced and sort of sought to navigate wisely as individuals and also as stewards of this is the organization we all work for, Cardis. So I want to turn the lens on Cardis a bit, which for listeners is the think tank that publishes Comment, and it is a nonpartisan think tank seeking to foster imagination for a thriving society. But it's one that doesn't specialize in foreign policy. So how should an organization like ours, like Cardis, think about its responsibilities in the current moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first thing to realize is that it is, in some sense, it is an international conflict, right? Israel is on the far side of the Mediterranean Sea, which is far from Hamilton and far from Ottawa. It's in fact far from Newfoundland, which is the furthest eastern part of our country. But what we've seen, at least on following October 7th, is a strange internalization of an international conflict. And the nature of that internalization and the nature of the way in which that conflict has made itself manifest in Canada is really quite complicated, and something we do actually have something to say about. Canada has had a very aggressive and I would say frightening and deeply concerning response where Jewish Canadians, not Israelis, Jewish Canadians have borne the brunt of these concerns. Cardis, one of the things that Cardis does is focus on religious freedom. We have a program about our sort of the way faith manifests itself in public square. And one of the things we did last year, before October 7th even happened, the previous year, was looking at religiously motivated hate crimes. And one thing that we saw in our data was that Jewish Canadians experienced hate crimes at a rate that was more than double the combined number of hate crimes experienced by all other religious groups in Canada. And since that time, it's only gotten worse. And so what appears to be an international conflict has become an internal domestic conflict. And it's a conflict about ethnic identity. It's a conflict about how we deal with history. It's a conflict about free speech. What is acceptable? What is not? What does resistance look like? What is justice? These are some of the deep questions that emerge out of this, and that I think Cardis is well suited. And I think our magazine, Anne, with Comment, is well suited to help people think through. I think that's part of our task as an institution. You talked about imagination towards a thriving society. And we say that imagination is shaped by 2,000 years of Christian social thought. And I think what we are calling as an institution and Comment as the magazine that sort of helps do that in an intentional way is to try to think about, what do those 2,000 years of Christian social thought, how do they help us answer those complex questions of justice, identity, speech? I think there are resources there for us to do, or to use to help us adjudicate these really hard questions, which are, at the end of the day, I hesitate to use the word side, because I'm a, in a world where there's polarization, I always like this. This sounds like a horrible cop out, but I'm like, I want to be on the side of justice. And now that means sometimes that you're going to be looking at both sides in a sort of like one-to-one conflict. But I do think you have to weigh the preponderance of evidence, and that's what our tradition helps us do. And I'll be very frank that when I weigh the preponderance of evidence, I see I see deep problems with our understanding of the nature of politics, the nature of war, and the nature of who bears responsibility. In Canada, and I'll be very just be very blunt. I think the Jews have borne. I think they've borne the weight when it's not actually their it is not their responsibility. I think they have borne a disproportionate blame for something that they are not to blame for, and I have real problems with that. And I think that blame stems from deep problems within our own Canadian society about the nature of justice, the nature of political authority, the nature in which that political authority is worked out. And I think our tradition, and I think Cardis as sort of a bearer and sort of steward of that tradition, has something to say about it.
Thanks, Brian. I might throw in a layer here, which is Cardis is a bit of all organizations are complex, and Cardis is complex in some interesting ways. In this case, because as Brian just said, part of our task is to help people think wisely and think well and see clearly in the context of sometimes ferocious undercurrents, culturally, society, world events, etc. So we're in the thinking business, and we're intentionally in the slow thought business. But we are also animated by 2,000 years of Christian social thought, and everyone who works at Cardis is a confessing Christian of different sort of theological traditions. And so there are natural allegiances and alliances and partnerships and communities, whether in Canada or the US, which have also found themselves in the various sides of this conflict, taking on various sides. So how does a think tank that's technically in the business of just trying to help people see as truthfully and clearly as possible, but that itself is rooted in a religious tradition that some would say has a bias on one side of this conflict, how are we navigating all of that? Are we doing that well?
I'll leave it to others in terms of how well we're doing. We're doing it imperfectly, and we are certainly doing it, I hope, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but it's not as if we get it right every day along the way. I think this is complex, and I think there are 3 levels I'd like to just highlight in answer to your question. So first is the way this manifests itself on a day-to-day basis. Cardis is our customer, to use that language. The person we are providing things to is not the political leader. It really doesn't matter what we say about the politics of the Middle East. It's not going to make a whit of difference. Along the way, there are minds way more informed and with hands on levers that we don't have. So really, our own position in taking a side in the issue is of no consequence. If you apply just war theory in terms of which original sin, when you look back and you start peeling back, do you start the story at October 7th? Do you start it with 1967? Do we go back thousands of years? You can frame the story in many different ways, depending on actually where you take your starting point. The reality is most of the people who turn to Cardis are ordinary civic society leaders. I spent part of this week with a business person who runs manufacturing facilities. I think he's got 30 some odd factories. He's got 19,000 employees. In his workplace are people of Jewish descent, and in his workplace are people of Palestinian descent. And these issues that are there affect people who work shoulder to shoulder on a day-to-day basis and are meeting in rooms. And people like that are looking for wisdom in terms of how do I navigate that? Do we just say this is a no-go zone? We're not going to talk about it? Well, I was present this week in a room where a mother, quite surprising to me, a professional who is somewhat, her public brand would be as a relatively tough lawyer, broke down in tears when we talked about something because of the challenges her children were facing at school because of their Jewish sympathies and all the rest. And it was somewhat out of the blue, if you will, in the context of the conversation, didn't expect the tears to come. Those are the real issues that people are facing. So I think number one is we need to make this very human. And that's where in my opening thing, I said empathy. And truthfully, I have as much empathy for those who are being challenged, who are Palestinians, as I do for those who are Jews. I'm dealing with that at a human level. And I think we need to start with that very real and human pain. And then I think we also have to call out those who are irresponsibly in trying to make a political statement, imposing pain on their neighbors for things their neighbors have no real agency in. But because, and when it's happening simply because of their ethnic background or their identity, that's very, very problematic. So I think we have to start at that very human level and always let that be the main thing. If we're invited to speak at the United Nations or some summit dealing with peace, great. Have your opinions there and make some arguments there. But let's deal with our neighbors regardless of where we stand on those issues or what our backgrounds are as neighbors. That said, at a second level, as I mentioned, I think there needs to be some moral clarity. There are issues here of consequence, and we can't just say, well, we're not going to pay attention to them. We're just going to get along in our workplace and everything else, because the workers also do go home and live in communities, and they go to synagogues, and Muslims are living in a community in which these issues are very real. They have family members in Palestine. You actually have to talk about it. You have to work your way through that.
There are so many tragedies in this. Christians would recognize that the war is necessary. It is always a tragedy. And one of the things I lament the most, and the thing that I pray for when I'm on, like, in my bed and doing my prayers before I sleep, is that every time somebody is killed, this is an old conflict. Every time somebody is killed, even if that is by the principle of double effect, it was an accident, it was or it was intentional. In the case of Hamas, it was intentional. Is that what I fear most and what I lament the most is the perpetuation of hatred between people for another 2 to 3 generations. That is what is happening. I believe that there is a sense in which that's the very real incarnate thing. My dad was killed by a bomb. My sister was raped by Hamas. And every time that happens, the human propensity is to say, I hate the person who did that, and I want revenge on their father and on their mother and on their children. And I don't want to say natural, because it's not the way we're made to be, but that is on this side of Genesis 3, our natural propensity. And that's why I think, that's the great tragedy of this. And that's why I think, as we think through this conflict, and I think the only way to do so without going insane or without turning into a monster is to use the sort of criteria of just war theory as developed by the Judeo-Christian tradition. And as I look through that, in the criteria is the war justified by Israel? Is Israel justified? I believe the answer is yes. My question, and I think this is an open question that I have not heard a good answer to, is Daniel Philpott, who's a scholar at the University of Notre Dame, says, just war theory must also have a just peace in mind at the end of it. You don't wage war eternally. So there must be a vision for a just peace. And that's where I think there is a giant question mark there. And I think, and this is my prayer, but it's also, I think, the way in which I am hoping to act, in which I think our tradition has something to say practically. The only way to achieve a just peace here is to have the type of imagination that is fueled by, I will say, Christianity, but I think that I hope there are resources both within Judaism. I know for sure there are resources within Judaism, and I hope that there are resources within Islam. I think there are, in which you deal with face-to-face the atrocities and the horrors that have taken place, and yet there is a place for, there will have to be forgiveness at some point, or this will never end. And I think about it, and forgiveness requires repentance. And it does require justice to be done, penance. I'm not a Catholic, but I do think there are things that need to be done. And that is, when we talk about imagination, that is the only way I can imagine a just peace coming out of this. And this is where I think our tradition has something to offer. And I think about the thing that has sort of said to me, I said, this isn't in track. Everyone says this is going to happen forever. I don't think that is necessarily true. I think, like, if you were to look at Nazi Germany in 1930s, 1940s, you would think this society will always hate Jews and it will always seek to kill them. And when I looked at what happened after October 7th, the speech that I think it was the German chancellor gave, the fact that the head of the Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force, was giving blood, his own blood, to provide life to those Israelis who needed blood. I thought to myself, how could that have happened? That would have been unimaginable in 1930s. And that's my hope, is that there is some, after the dust has settled, there will need to be some sort of spiritual, there's a spiritual battle being fought here. And people often think, oh, spiritual is just the angels and demons and stuff doing over there. It doesn't really, it's another realm. No, it actually has very real impact. We've seen it with apartheid. I think we've seen it in Canada. I think the role that faith plays in reconciliation with other long, intractable tragedies. Without that, and I don't have hope, but with it, I actually do.
Yeah, I think it's the only hope. But it comes, that notion of like digging deep into a much more robust conception of political forgiveness, which we have a version of in Rwanda. We have versions of in various truth and reconciliation commissions, all of Dan Philpott's work. But it comes at a time when the muscles for appreciating or even conceiving that forgiveness could ever be possible have, in my view, have maybe never been more anemic. Maybe they have been, but we're at a very societal, like there is complete anemia around forgiveness as an option. So it's quite an opportunity for, I think, that Christian power to scandalize the world. But how that actually works itself out in a geopolitical context.
I agree with you. I think the muscles that we have very well developed muscles for holding swords, and we have very well developed, and it seems to me to be sort of a little bit on steroids of our hatred and vengeance, as opposed to just retribution. I think we have and it does take a significant amount of work, and I do say there are, though, little communities, and I will say they're in Palestine, they're in Israel, they're amongst Jews, amongst Muslims, and small bits of encouragement even in Canada. I think the sort of vast preponderance of the organizational voices for Muslims in Canada have been utter failures, but there are small groups saying, hold on here, guys. And I would say that too, like let's not be under any illusion that there are those who support Israel as I do, who are letting themselves go towards vengeance, which is not justice. And I think there is, like, we will have to look to some of those small communities. I know, Anne, as your editorial leadership under comment has been to sort of try to highlight those, even old ones like the Beguines, in the Middle Ages, Beguines, these little weird communities that sort of, hold on here, what are they doing? They're so strange, and they're, Lord willing, can be small seeds that will grow.
Just translating that into the domestic situation, I think there are two competing principles at work. I'll start with the more hopeful one, and that is subsidiarity, in the sense that we're able to push these down, and there are local communities, and there are people who you would expect to be opposite sides, but actually have to deal with each other as people and begin some conversations. When that actually happens, there are wonderful stories of hope and all the rest. The challenge, and I sense that from my reading of the coverage in the U.S., but I can speak a little more informed regarding the Canadian situation. The challenge is that this has been superimposed, especially on university campuses, but in the politics in the street. I live in Ottawa. I'm looking out of my window at the Parliament buildings. There are almost weekly protests here, and I have lingered at the edges of them in terms of what all, trying to listen in terms of where it's at. The language and the paradigm is entirely oppressed and oppressor. And when that becomes the identity and the paradigm on which you superimpose this conflict, forgiveness has no place in that particular paradigm. So there, as we're moving at a broader level, we are imposing a post-liberal. I don't want to just use labels. There's lots more nuance, but that oppressor-oppressed paradigm is something that's quite post-liberal in terms of our institutions. And unfortunately, this is being used to pour some gas on that fire, which is making the notion of forgiveness, relationship, and even the principle of subsidiarity more difficult to implement.
It also reinforces that thing. It says like you can't. Like you're talking about the muscle, and it's like the muscle is like it's a reciprocal thing, right? When you're in a relationship, there has to be a give and a take. It's a call and response. And if you're, if you have somebody who says, "Come, let us reason together," that's that passage in Isaiah, right? Which is held by Christians, held by Jews. It says, "Come, let us reason together. Though your sins are like scarlet, I'll make them white as snow," etc. It's like, okay, you say, let's sit down and reason together. Here's the way I see it. Here's our faults. And in a culture where admitting your faults is the other side goes, bang, I told you, I knew it. It actually acts as a barrier to those types of conversations. As Ray is saying, when it's oppressed and oppressor, you're all in or all out. And I think this is critically important for all of us as people who are committed to sort of a deep humanism. And I think this would be true for agnostics as much as it is for those who are people of faith, is to say, I will not engage in that type of behavior. If we're talking about the public thing as a gymnasium, it only helps some muscles. And you've got these weird little people, again, who are saying, no, I actually want to talk to you, even though you may hate me. And there is this sort of risk that needs to be taken. And that's a challenge. And in politics, that challenge is even more difficult because the point of the state, the purpose of the state, its primary role is to provide security for its citizens. And frankly, I think Netanyahu is a failure in that regard. I think he deserves much of the blame for not being prepared. I think Hamas is an utter failure. And the fact that it is the political authority, I think people are forgetting this as well. It is the political authority in Palestine, whether we like it or not.
Or whether it's legitimate or not.
That's exactly. A very good point. It's so-called, if it's upheld and there hasn't been an election in some time, and there's thuggery and all the rest of stuff as they do. But the point I'm trying to make is it's difficult for political actors, especially, to take that step. And that's where there's a certain boldness and statesman or stateswomanship that needs a statecraft that needs to be there, that you're willing to extend an olive branch while also having your troops ready. And that's one of those weird things. It's how does a political leader do that? It's difficult. And I will be honest, that part of me says, well, the Germans only came around to their confession and their repentance after we had beaten them with military might. And I actually don't know the answer, Anne. I don't know. Like I say, is this a point where Hamas has to be utterly, politically beaten before there can be a chance for repentance? That's kind of where I think it's the case. Iran needs to be removed, and I think there are real geopolitical things. But that's the hard part. That's the difficult part.
Right. You earlier invoked this word subsidiarity. I actually think would be an amazing separate conversation to explore the relationship between the possibilities of forgiveness and a healthy subsidiarity, maybe for a future Cardis convention. But I'm going to back into this. Bear with me. I'm going to meander in, and I don't mean for this to be navel gazing either personally or institutionally, but as said at the outset of this episode in the introduction, part of this conversation is prompted out of a very particular circumstance. I mean, Cardis, like all organizations, especially if you're in the realm of ideas, has been walking through the last 7-8 months of this conflict in the Middle East, I think with as much sort of wisdom and also self-awareness as to where we don't have the expertise to go, where our own mission and telos is sort of, there's a discernment about how much you engage and in what ways you engage, publicly and privately. But we are sensitive people. We are Christians who care deeply about the world and being sort of obedient listeners to God in the fraught currents of our world. And so all of this has been live. And I want to ask a question about sort of norms and spheres in this moment. So this, about a month ago when I hosted an episode on this podcast with two longstanding peacemakers, one a Palestinian Christian, one a Jewish Israeli, who were recommended to me by an organization I deeply trust and admire, Telos, which forms peacemakers in the U.S., Christian organization. And elements of the conversation, and they were both more pacifist by sort of disposition and philosophy. And it was right at the sort of high point of U.S. college campus protests really going wild and proliferating. And the public opinion tides in the U.S. on these protests were sort of shifting. So initially, I think a lot of people were supportive. And then as many protests, I would argue, were becoming increasingly undisciplined, sloppy, seeming to start to lack integrity. It wasn't just about a humanitarian cause in Gaza. They were lumping in all these other things. This particular podcast episode with these two individuals was happening in that live events that were moving very, very quickly. And I'm struck by how here Cardis publishes Comment, which I lead, and I always try to honor Cardis and feel like it is the soil out of which Comment, as sort of a gopher publication out there, which has a magazine, podcast, events, like is somewhat in the realm of media, meaning we are meant to be a hospitable place to the free exploration of ideas and all different kinds of perspectives. That a magazine, I think this was a moment, the point of conflict over having to take down an episode that risked misconstruing my own views and certainly the views of Cardis in a pretty hot moment of fast-moving events. How do we understand like a magazine's role to be like deeply intellectually hospitable for the sake of seeking understanding, for the sake of educating our human sentiments, to your point earlier, Ray, and then the sort of natural loyalties of the publisher, in this case, a think tank, which has slightly different norms. I think not overly opposing norms, but has a slightly different both craft, goals, actually slightly different audience, et cetera. So yeah, this is a slightly complex question, but we talk a lot at Cardis and at Comment about really valuing institutional and intellectual hospitality. And yet there also comes a moment where when you are opening yourself up and opening your space up to voices that have something deeply of value to say that opens up the eyes of your audience, they may also say other things that you're not necessarily blessing. So that's a messy way of walking in, but just to peel back the curtain here, these are, I think a lot of us feel like in a flattened spherical world, these are the moments when great wisdom is required, and sometimes there's real clashes between the spheres. In this case, including between two, or an organization somewhat within an organization.
Yeah. So a couple things, and I really appreciate the question, Anne. And, as our audience will discern from the question, this isn't the first time we're having this sort of a conversation about this specific sort of incident in terms of how exactly the different roles and responsibilities. So just give me 30 seconds just to frame the two institutions for our readers or listeners rather than just assume. So Cardis is a think tank. We have various research programs. We do a next generation young, and we publish a magazine. So within each of those programs, there is a different mandate and a different sort of audience that we're targeting and a reason. And we have internal articulate reasons as to why we do everything. So when it comes to comment, when I sat down with Anne some years ago in terms of trying to recruit her to this position, my emphasis to her was we view comment very much as the research and development department. You've got much more latitude. You're not stuck. We don't want comment to be a Cardis shill. You're not just selling all the research that Cardis does. In fact, we want you to be the place of intellectual exploration. Now, there are boundaries to that. We are an organization that is explicitly Christian. We use the Apostles' Creed basis. We have Catholics, Protestants, Greek Orthodox, and all the different versions and varieties, and we welcome internally a variety of opinions as well, as long as they are within a certain framework of boundaries. So there are guardrails within which but we have and we will continue to publish a variety of opinions on different matters. And when we publish something in comment or we do a podcast, that's not the Cardis position in the same way as when our family program or our work in economics program publishes a research paper that collects data and brings that out into the public square. There are differences along the way. So that's the context in which we are going. That said, if we take the principle of subsidiarity, which is a historic Roman Catholic principle, but has been broadly accepted, and there's a Protestant version of, I won't muddy the waters by getting into the different theological terms. But essentially, it is that as you organize society, you put the responsibility at the place closest to the front line. So the notion is that a family is far more capable of making decisions regarding parenting than the state is, because they're closer to it. And different families actually may make quite different decisions. And it's actually wrong for the state to step in and make decisions in those different spheres. Now, that doesn't mean the state has absolutely nothing to say about family. For example, if there's child abuse or if there's gross injustice within a family, a state has a certain responsibility. So, that's a very simplistic explanation of a complex topic with lots of nuance. But I think that is an important thing that comes in, and we try to practice that even within an organization. And although I represent Cardis as the publisher of comment, I do my very best to hire the best editor, and I think I did a pretty good job at that.
Agreed.
Along the way. And I try to ensure that she and her team have the resources and are free to make decisions along the way. But we also need to take a look. My job at the organization not just regards comment, but every one of the programs, insofar as I'm responsible for them, is they are part of a whole. I need to make sure those guardrails on the outside are protected. I also need to protect the fact that every report we publish, everything to some extent needs to stand on its own. Not that you say everything in anything, but there are people who are going to encounter a single issue of comment, a single report, a single podcast episode. And there needs to be something where, taken by itself, it is consistent with and not in conflict. Doesn't have to say everything. It can be part of the equation. And, in terms of the specific issue, the concern basically came that when that issue, taken by itself and heard by itself without reference to some of the other things that Cardis publishes, may leave listeners with a view of the issue that did not reflect entirely on the organization, and perhaps even may have rubbed against some of the guardrails of what we were doing. And hence we made, and this in doing this for almost 25 years now, this is the first time we've withdrawn something, if you will. So this is not something we've done lightly or easily, but it just was felt that in this moment, and maybe if this wasn't in the news and there weren't hot takes being taken all around, an episode like this lands differently. But that's not our present situation. We are in the midst of conflict, and the very thing that gave rise to it also will give rise to the misinterpretation of that. And it just feels that when you put something out and you're conscious that a significant constituency will misinterpret what was intended by that and come to conclusions which are not intended, then probably the responsible thing is to withdraw it. And, we want to be very transparent about that. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this very episode, just to communicate also with our audience, that we have editorial integrity, that we're not running from the decisions that were made, and that when we perhaps didn't get things totally perfect along the way through a variety of circumstances, not intentional, but even unintentional, that we're trying to own up to it and to make it right.
Cardis as a whole believes in institutions. And I think it's just worth noting, especially for, say, perhaps some younger people in our listenership who understandably may have a very inflexible sensation when they think of institutions that they have walked away from, that at their healthiest, institutions like Cardis, which is not huge, but roughly I think around 40 people or so, maybe a little less than that, are living organisms. It's not like sort of a machine or a factory where everyone is like doing the exact same thing. That ideally it is made up of individuals who are in a constant journey together of shared work, shared learning, and really appreciating and giving varying degrees of freedom to different kinds of roles and vocational gifts. And overall, I think I have felt that Cardis does that beautifully. And it's I think just these last number of months weathering very unforgiving, punishing public wins from both the left and the right is specific to all things Israel, Gaza. I've just been struck by the courage of an organization like Cardis and all of our own, our imperfections, but to value, okay, it's good to have a bridge builder over here. It's good to have Brian, a gregarious friend maker of, with all tribes and tongues over here. And it's good to have those who have a real sense of who the core stakeholders are, and how that all weaves together is a symphony. And sometimes it's messy and sometimes you get a little off kilter. But I just want to acknowledge that I think healthy institutions at their best, and I think Cardis strives for this, has a wisdom around leveraging different gifts for different purposes and not having it be like some totalitarian, homogenous, one party line thing. You guys can feel free to disagree with me there. It's a risk, but it's a beautiful risk, and it's worth protecting.
Yeah, preach. I think that's eloquently put, Anne. I think that's precisely it. And I think that that's the risk, right? That's the risk. It's like human beings our institutions are intended. This is one of the things we have an article. It's sort of like one of our core things is we believe in faithful institutions. Loving faithful institutions is part of that. And the reason why we care about institutions is that's the way in which we live the fullness of our life. And I find that, and I would say that, like, I note that you referred specifically to those who are a little bit younger, who are skeptical about institutions. I would say that skepticism actually runs right across our society, and it's, I would say boomers are particularly skeptical of institutions too, in some strange way. But the question then becomes, like, how else do you do things together, right? Like how else are we going to do justice? And because we're social creatures, and I think that that's the case, and I think, though, the thing that sort of guides it is that institutions, the variety of different institutions, have different telos. They have different ends. My family has very different ends than my workplace. As much as I love my workplace, and there are sort of analogically, I feel there's a certain familial bond, but it's an analogy. It's not an actual family, and there's something beautiful about that. And I think if we're going to look at things and critique them, it should always be to say, how can those things achieve their desired end in a better way? And that's like when it comes to the Israel and Palestine thing, there is a key political element to it. It is political. It's cultural. It's there's ethnic things involved in there. There are religious elements, but helping or having a lens by which this is its task, it helps us think more clearly, and I think then opens up that possibility for a hopeful future, which is what Cardis tries to do. That's our sort of promise, that we're always going to be hopeful, and try to offer something that is hopeful rather than bleak and just full of despair. And I just don't want any part of that. So.
If I can just jump in on this, I think even the word institution needs some clarification in our context, because I think when people think of institution, they think of something static with an organizational chart. And that is, very structured accountability and everything else. I think of institutions as much more dynamic organizations in which there's an ebb and a flow. It's not a perfect analogy by any stretch, but if we're climbing Mount Everest, number one,
there's lineups,
and sometimes
apparently there are lineups at Everest.
So first of all, you don't get there. The aim of going on Mount Everest is not just arriving at the summit. Obviously, that's the aim. That's what everybody is doing. But the vast majority of people who make the trek up Everest never actually see the summit for all sorts of reasons that are totally beyond their capacities, whether all of the other. Secondly, it's not alone. You can't climb Mount Everest successfully alone along the way. There are Sherpas. There are a host of. So in many ways, if the mission of an organization is climbing Mount Everest, there needs to be as much attention paid to the journey and to the relationships and the growth in the journey that actually creates the capacity to actually achieve the summit. And I think that in many ways, when you join I'm struck. We read in church the other day the passage from Peter in which it talks about living stones, which is really a contradictory analogy. And yet, I thought and that's applied to the church, but I think there's something true about institutions in that regard. On the one hand, there is an infrastructure, there is an org chart, there is stones, there's an edifice that needs to be there. But an institution that's not alive, that doesn't grow, that doesn't morph, that doesn't adjust. So at the end of the day, God's providence is going to determine the degree of success or contribution we make to whatever issues we tackle, whether it's, this particular one, which is not at the heart, but is something that, because it's real, we have to deal with, or the other issues. Those are things, whether we make the summit or not, there is something about the life of the journey and working with the Sherpas, and seeing everybody as part of that journey and all playing our part and recognizing those roles that actually contributes to it makes an institution a contributor to a healthy society along the way.
I'll just end with a question for each of you, which is, how do you hope Cardis, as the ecumenical Christian think tank that it is and sort of cultural catalyst and equipper, what do you hope will be said of its navigation of times that may not be any more complex than any other time, but can sometimes in the windscreen feel as much? What do you hope is said about how we kind of row through these rapids?
I think the first thing that I would hope for is that we would be an organization that is trustworthy, and that's just sort of it's just worthy of your trust. Like you can count on us. And this is in the midst, and as you noted at the very beginning, of a sort of decline of trust, a culture of decline in trust in almost every institution. I think some of that lack of trust is not earned, but I think there's plenty of it that has been earned. distrust in financial institutions. 2008 gives you a lot of reason to not trust them. Government, there's plenty of examples of it. You could just go on. So the question is, how do you fix that? And I think we can fix that by taking responsibility for what we have agency over. And if we're an institution that is trying to do as we say our mission is, which is to use 2,000 years of Christian social thought to provide an imaginative view of a thriving society that can be like actually done using evidence and all the rest of that stuff, then it starts by us being very open about us being very frank about our ends, our goals, being transparent, and also being willing to say we're wrong. And I think that's the challenge, asking for forgiveness, to model that very muscle that we talked about was so needed in our society. And, I've got lots of things in my work here at Cardis that I'd like to have accomplished. Like, I'd love to see us in our country not euthanize people who are sick or disabled. I'd like us to see care for them in the fullness of their humanity. I'd like to see thriving families. I'd like to see an economy that's burgeoning and everyone's employed with meaningful work. I have all these sort of like objectives, an education system that's pluralist, that meets every child's needs. And, I could go on and on and on and bore the snot out of everybody. But I think, okay, but how do we go about doing that? It's at the end of the day by being a trustworthy institution. And to do that means that, we are very clear about our where we're at and why we care about these things. And we're very clear about our objectives and how we go about doing them. I think, transparency, there's radical transparency where you're showing everything on Instagram and, sharing everything in your life. But there's this sort of basic institution of like being very clear about your goals and being very open to being held accountable to the means of which you try to achieve them. And I think that, your work in particular at Comment Dan has been a model of that. And I serve as your sort of lieutenant on that ship, but it's
sometimes tenant. It's like, yeah, we'll say lieutenant.
Yeah.
Let's be real
for the
here,
American
Brian.
listeners. That means lieutenant. But there is a sense in which that's what we're trying to do. Like, restoring trust takes time, and that's the other thing, right? Is patient. I'm thinking a lot about 1 Corinthians lately. And I do think, in a culture that is so harsh and aggressive and immediate, when you hear words like love is patient, love is kind, love is gentle, that sounds really squishy for somebody who works in policy. It sounds really squishy. But I think it's like the most solid thing you can base your work on. It's rock solid. That's my hope for this institution.
As someone in my position in terms of co-founder, leading in an executive sort of broad way, I have to think about the Cardis brand as communicating a trust. That when you see something with Comment or Cardis on it, that it is trustworthy. We need to be very attentive that when we communicate something as a fact or a data, that you can rely on that being a balanced, it's something you can invest. So we provide data, facts. Secondly, we provide a vocabulary. I think one of the issues that is here is that, we talked earlier in terms of identity versus sort of the liberal rights politics along the way. There is an emerging new vocabulary in our society. Some of it is very unhelpful and unclarifying. And part of our tool is both to expose that vocabulary in terms of what it means and help people understand it, as well as create an alternative vocabulary. And vocabulary isn't about satisfying yourself. I always say in communication, there are 3 things. There's something I intend to communicate. There's the words I actually use. And then there's what you hear. And it's what you hear that actually matters. And I fear that often we have become illiterate in how our neighbors are hearing us. And we are using words that we feel better about ourselves, but don't necessarily communicate to our neighbors what it is that we intend. So I think, at Cardis, we have we provide data, facts, we provide a vocabulary, and then we provide a platform. This is a place in which you can have conversations that otherwise are not happening.
I'm really grateful for both of you. I hope you know how much I love working alongside you and making mistakes in the context of working with you and disagreeing with you about those mistakes sometimes, and just hopefully walking arm in arm to chisel one another and serve our societies as best we can. So thank you for this conversation, and see you around.
Thank you, Anne.
Thanks, Anne.
Thanks for listening to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. We exist to foster imagination for a thriving society, and our product line is blossoming. We publish a beautiful print magazine 4 times a year that tries to peer into timely societal questions lurking just behind our everyday consciousness. We publish an additional slew of online essays and personality-flavored columns like Matthew Milliner's Material Mysticism, Greg Thompson's The Welcome Table, and Alan Jacobs' Snakes and Ladders. And we are building an exciting new podcast network with The Whole Person Revolution, joined by Zealots at the Gate, a conversation about religion and democracy with Shadi Hamid and Matthew Koenig. All of this is animated by a rich Christian humanist tradition that we feel well poised to pick up and apply to our times. Please consider participating in this 2,000-year-old conversation and the community rallying around it now. You can write, you can read, you can host a comment supper in your neighborhood, or attend one of our webinars with an author and your fellow readers. We want to equip you to be an agent of renewal in our time, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at podcasts@comment.org and expect a substantive exchange. We are honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comment, edited by Becca Bruder, produced and with original music by Allie Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you in a month.